There is a specific sound that a police radio makes in a quiet residential street on a Tuesday morning. A flat, static-edged crackle that doesn't belong among birdsong and sprinklers, and I will hear it for the rest of my life every time a room goes too quiet. My name is Steven. I'm 43 years old, a high school history teacher in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and on the morning of October 14th, I was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee watching two unmarked sedans pull up in front of our house, while my daughter Chloe ate cereal at the table behind me, and my son Owen was upstairs looking for his left shoe. I had known something was wrong for 11 weeks. I had not known it would look like this. For people got out of the cars. Two in suits, two in uniforms. They walked up our front path with the unhurried purposefulness of people who have done this before and are not in a hurry because they are certain of the outcome. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands have started to feel unreliable, and I turned to look at Chloe. She was watching the window. She had her spoon halfway to her mouth, and she had stopped moving. "Daddy," she said. "Who are those people?" I didn't answer. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock, because I needed, in whatever way I could manage, to control at least the shape of the next 60 seconds. The woman in front held up a badge. "Mr. Stephen Hargrove?" "Yes," I said. "Is Melissa Hargrove home?" Behind me, on the stairs, I heard Owen stop moving. And somewhere further back in the house, I heard Melissa's footsteps pause in the hallway, the way footsteps pause when a person hears their name said by a stranger in a tone they recognize. What happened in the next 4 minutes would take me months to fully absorb. But the moment I need to tell you about, the one that changed the entire shape of what I thought I knew, came later. Much later. In a jail visitation room with fluorescent lights and a scratched plastic divider. When Melissa looked at me across the table and said 7 words that made everything I had suspected collapse into something I hadn't seen coming at all. But first, I need to tell you how we got there. Cedar Falls is the kind of place where everyone knows what kind of car you drive and notices when you park somewhere new. We had lived there for 9 years, in a house on Birchwood Lane with a porch swing Chloe refused to share and a backyard Owen had systematically destroyed with his various engineering projects. I taught 11th grade American history at Jefferson High and coached the junior varsity debate team, which meant I spent most of my professional life teaching young people to examine evidence and question assumptions, a skill I had somehow failed to apply to my own household. Melissa had worked as a bookkeeper for Harlan Construction for 4 years. The job had come at the right time. Owen was 9, Chloe was just turning 5, and Melissa had been restless in the particular way of a person whose intelligence is underused and who doesn't have the language yet to say so. Ryan Harlan had hired her after a brief interview she came home from describing as the first time in years she'd felt like a professional in a room. I had been glad for her. That's the part one keep returning to. Not guilt, exactly, but the specific clarity of understanding that my gladness had been entirely about her contentment and not at all about what the job actually was or who it involved. I had celebrated her satisfaction without asking a single question about the environment producing it. Ryan Harlan was 47, twice divorced, ran a mid-sized residential construction operation that did solid work at the upper end of the Cedar Falls market. I had met him twice. Once at a company Christmas party 2 years ago, once when Melissa had asked me to drop off some files at the office. He was the kind of man who filled rooms without trying, who made direct eye contact and remembered names, and had the easy authority of someone who had never doubted that people would listen to him. I had not liked him. I filed that reaction under I'm being paranoid and moved on. The first thing I genuinely noticed, not filed, not explained away, but actually registered, was in late July. Melissa had always managed the household finances, which was sensible given her professional training and a relief to me, since numbers beyond a certain complexity make my eyes lose focus in a way my students find amusing. We had a joint account for household expenses and separate accounts for personal spending, an arrangement that had worked without friction for a decade. In late July, she mentioned, at dinner, that she thought we should consolidate some savings, move a portion of Owen's college fund into a different vehicle that offered better returns. She explained it in the language of someone who handles money professionally, and I nodded and said it sounded sensible, and she handled it the following week. I did not look at the account afterward. I had never looked at the accounts. That was her domain, and I had seeded it completely and called the seeding trust. Something small tightened in my chest when she mentioned it, though. Not suspicion, more like the faint awareness of a door I hadn't noticed before, in a room I thought I knew well. I didn't open the door. I was very good at not opening doors. Pete came over for a cookout in early August, my oldest friend, a contractor who had known Melissa almost as long as I had. We were standing at the grill while Melissa and the kids were inside, and Pete said, out of nowhere, "You know Ryan Harlan's reputation, right?" "Professionally," I said. Pete turned his beer, among other things. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who has said as much as he's decided to say and is leaving the rest to me. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Just keep your eyes open," he said. "That's all." I didn't ask him to elaborate. That was my mistake, one of several, but the first one with a specific shape I can now identify. Pete had offered me something, and I had declined it, because accepting it would have meant beginning a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I turned the burgers instead and changed the subject, and Pete let me, and we never returned to it. Looking back now, that moment at the grill was the clearest warning I received, and the one I most deliberately chose not to hear. Pete knew something. He handed it to me gently, the way you hand something fragile to a person you're not sure will hold it. I set it down. The energy in the house shifted in August. Not dramatically. Melissa didn't become a different person overnight. But there were new textures to ordinary evenings. A quickness when her phone buzzed, a particular brightness after certain workdays, a habit of taking her laptop to the bedroom after the kids were down, which she explained as catching up on quarterly reports. All of it had innocent explanations. All of it accumulated. Chloe asked me one evening, while I was reading to her, "Is Mommy in trouble?" I looked up from the book. Why would Mommy be in trouble? She shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 7-year-old concealing something specific. "She cries sometimes. In the bathroom." I heard her. I held that information for a moment. "Mommy's just stressed about work, sweetheart." Chloe looked at me with the particular expression children use when they know an adult is giving them the simplified version and have decided to accept it for now. I lay awake that night for a long time. Not because of what Chloe had said, because of the ease with which I had answered her. I had explained away my daughter's observation in real time, automatically, without examining it first. That was the moment I understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that I had been doing this for weeks. September arrived with the particular quality of Midwestern early autumn. Cool mornings, afternoons that still held summer's warmth, the smell of cut grass, and something drying out. I went back to school. My students were juniors studying the progressive era, and I spent 3 weeks teaching them about institutional corruption and the people who enabled it through silence, and I did not apply a single lesson to my own life. Melissa was working longer hours. The explanation was a large commercial project. Harlan Construction had won a contract to build a mixed-use development on the east side of Cedar Falls, and the bookkeeping demands had expanded accordingly. This was verifiable. The project was real. The contract had been announced in the local paper, and Melissa's longer hours were consistent with the timeline. What was not consistent, and what I finally allowed myself to notice in the second week of September, was the quality of her attention when she came home. Melissa had always been what I thought of as a present person. When she was home, she was home. She engaged with Owen's school projects and Chloe's drawings and my classroom stories with genuine interest. That quality had been one of the things I'd loved first about her. In September, it was intermittently absent, replaced by a version of presence that looked right but had less weight to it. The way a photocopy looks like a document until you try to use it. I made a decision that I am not entirely proud of. On a Thursday evening while Melissa was giving Chloe a bath, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the household banking app on my laptop. I had the login credentials. Melissa had shared them years ago for emergencies. I had never used them. What I found took me 40 minutes to understand and another 20 to accept. Over the previous 3 months, a total of $18,000 had moved out of our household savings account in 7 transactions. The receiving account was not the college fund vehicle Melissa had mentioned. It was an account I didn't recognize, with a routing number that a basic search suggested belonged to a private business account. I sat very still for a long time. I did not confront Melissa that evening. I closed the laptop and I helped get Chloe to bed, and I read 2 chapters of Owen's book with him, and I lay beside Melissa in the dark and I said nothing, which was the most characteristic thing I had ever done in our marriage, and also, I now understand, the most damaging. I called Pete the next morning from my car in the school parking lot. before first period. Tell me what you know about Ryan Harlan, I said. A pause. How much do you want to know? All of it. Pete told me that Ryan Harlan had a history. Not criminal, nothing prosecuted, but a pattern that people in the local construction community knew about. He had a habit of forming close relationships with female employees, relationships that typically involved financial arrangements that benefited both parties in ways that were difficult to categorize cleanly. One previous bookkeeper had left under circumstances that involved a quiet settlement. Another had relocated to Des Moines without explanation. People knew about this? I said. People talked about it, Pete said carefully. It's not the same thing. Did you know Melissa was? I suspected, Pete said. I didn't know. That's why I said what I said at the cookout. Stephen, I'm sorry. I should have been more direct. No, I said. I should have asked. I sat in the school parking lot until the bell rang for first period. Then I went inside and taught the progressive era to 31 teenagers who had no idea that their teacher was methodically dismantling the story of his own marriage in real time. The financial picture clarified over the following 2 weeks. I pulled every statement I could access. The $18,000 was not the full amount. It was the amount from the joint account. When I looked at the household credit card statement, I found additional charges I couldn't account for. A hotel in Iowa City, a restaurant in Ames, 2 charges at a jewelry store in the corridor that I had never visited and Melissa had never mentioned. The jewelry store bothered me most. Not the amount, the implication. I understood by the end of September that I was dealing with something that had 2 components, a personal betrayal and a financial one, and that they were connected in a way I hadn't yet fully mapped. What I didn't understand, and what I would not understand until the fluorescent lights of a visitation room, was that the financial component was far larger and far more complicated than anything I had found. October in Cedar Falls. The maples on Birchwood Lane turned the color of rust, and the mornings got cold enough to see your breath, and I drove to school every day past the same streets I had driven for 9 years and felt like I was looking at a landscape I no longer recognized from the inside. I had retained an attorney, not a divorce attorney, not yet, but a general practice lawyer named Carol who had handled our house closing and who I trusted to tell me honestly what I was looking at. I laid everything out for her in her office on a Saturday morning while Melissa thought I was at a department curriculum meeting. The account transfers, the credit card charges, the information Pete had given me about Ryan Harlan's pattern. Carol listened with the particular focused stillness of someone processing information rapidly. The account the money went to, she said. Did you look at what kind of account it is? A business account, I said. I couldn't get further than that. She looked at me carefully. Stephen, if Melissa is the bookkeeper for Harlan Construction and money is moving from your household account into a business account connected to that firm, that's not just a marital issue. That could be financial fraud. Depending on the structure, it could be embezzlement. I heard the word embezzlement, and something in my chest went very cold. From us, I said, or from his company. That, Carol said, is the question. I drove home from her office and I pulled into the driveway, and I sat there for 11 minutes. I remember the time because I watched the clock, and I thought about Melissa. About the woman who had grown up in a household where her father's gambling had meant the electricity got cut twice and the Christmas gifts had come from a church donation box. About the way she checked the grocery receipt every single time, without fail, even when we had more than enough money not to care. About the fear I had always read as frugality and never examined more deeply than that. I understood something in the driveway that I had not understood before. Her fear of not having enough was not rational. It was not about our current circumstances. It was older than our marriage, older than her job, older than Ryan Harlan. It was the kind of fear that lives in a person's bones and drives them toward things that feel like safety even when those things are the opposite of safe. That realization didn't excuse anything, but it changed the shape of what I was looking at from a simple betrayal into something more complicated and, in a strange way, more human. I did not confront Melissa, not because I was afraid, because I had spoken to Carol again, who had told me that if there was a genuine fraud element, I needed to be careful about what I said and when. The wrong conversation at the wrong moment could compromise things I hadn't yet identified. So I waited. I went on teaching the progressive era. I helped Owen with his science fair project. I read to Chloe every night. I lay beside Melissa in the dark and I said nothing, and the nothing had a different quality now, not the nothing of conflict avoidance, but the nothing of a man who has finally understood that silence can be a choice made in clarity rather than fear. Pete came over on a Sunday in early October, ostensibly to help me fix a gutter. We worked in companionable silence for a while, and then he said, quietly, "Anything I should know?" "Not yet," I said. "Soon." He nodded. He handed me a screw. We fixed the gutter. 2 days before the arrest, Chloe brought home a drawing she'd made at school. It was a picture of our family, 4 figures in front of a house, drawn in the flat, earnest style of a 7-year-old who is trying to get the proportions right. She had drawn Melissa's figure slightly apart from the other 3, on the edge of the paper, with a space between her and the rest of us that Chloe had not, I suspected, consciously intended. I put it on the refrigerator. I stood looking at it for a long time. Children draw what they see. Chloe had been seeing this for months, in the texture of evenings and the quality of her mother's attention, and she had put it on paper without knowing she was documenting anything. That drawing is still in a box somewhere. I kept it. I'm still not entirely sure why. The arrest happened at 8:17 in the morning. Melissa came downstairs when she heard voices at the front door. She was in a gray sweater, her hair still damp from the shower, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs when she saw the 4 people behind me, and her face did something I had never seen it do before. Not fear, not surprise, but a very specific kind of recognition, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a knock and has finally heard it. "Melissa Hargrove?" The woman with the badge stepped forward. "I'm Special Agent Torres from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud and embezzlement." Owen had come to the top of the stairs. He was holding his shoe, the left one, which he had finally found, and he stood very still. Chloe was still at the kitchen table. She had turned around on her chair, and she was watching with the wide, still attention of a child who understands that something large is happening and that the adults in the room have run out of scripts. Melissa looked at me, not at the agents. At me. "Stephen," she said. "I know," I said. That was all I said. 2 words, and she understood from them that I had known, not everything, but something, for longer than she had realized. They let her put on shoes. They walked her out the front door and down the path in the October morning, and I stood in the doorway watching, and Owen came downstairs and stood beside me, and Chloe came and stood on my other side, and the 3 of us watched Melissa get into the back of one of the sedans. She looked back once, through the window, at the 3 of us in the doorway. Then the car moved, and she was gone. I closed the front door very quietly. I turned around. Owen was looking at me with 11-year-old seriousness, his shoe still in his hand. "Dad," he said, "what's happening?" "I'm going to explain everything I can," I said. "But first I need you to get your shoes on and get Chloe's bag. I'm going to call Grandma Iris, and she's going to come stay with you while I figure some things out." "Okay." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded and went to get his sister's bag. Children absorb more than we think they can hold. Owen had understood, from the expression on my face and the 2 words I'd said to his mother, that I was not as surprised as I should have been. He was processing that information in real time. I could see it happening. I didn't have the tools to address it yet, so I gave him a task instead, which was what I always did. Gave people something concrete to hold when the abstract became unbearable. Iris arrived within 20 minutes. My mother had always moved fast when she was needed. She came in and took both kids with the efficient warmth of a grandmother who asks no questions in front of children and saves all of them for later, and I sat at the kitchen table in the sudden quiet of a house that had just had its center removed, and I called Carol. "It happened," I said when she answered. A pause. "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Can I come in today?" I saw Melissa 3 days later. The charges were wire fraud and embezzlement, not from our household account, or not primarily. The $18,000 from our savings was real, but it was, as it turned out, the smallest part of the picture. Ryan Harlan's construction company had been the vehicle for a much larger scheme. Falsified subcontractor invoices, inflated materials costs, payments routed through a shell company that Melissa had established and maintained. The total amount was not $18,000. It was $430,000, accumulated over 22 months. Melissa had not spent it on herself. Or not primarily. That was the part one couldn't assemble from the outside. I needed to hear it from her. The visitation room at the Lynn County facility had the particular institutional quality of places designed to be functional and nothing else. Plastic chairs, a scratch divider, fluorescent light, that made everyone look slightly unwell. Melissa sat across from me, and she looked diminished in a way I had never seen her look before, not smaller physically but reduced, as if something she'd been inflating with effort for a long time had finally been allowed to deflate. "You knew," she said. It was not a question. "I knew about the affair," I said. "I knew about some of the money. I didn't know the scale." She looked at her hands. "How long?" "Since September," I said. "Carol told me to wait." She absorbed that with a small nod, the way people absorb information they've already half prepared for. "I need to understand," I said. "Not for the lawyers. For me. I need to understand what this actually was." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and what she said next was not what I had prepared myself for. "Stephen," she said, "Ryan didn't know about most of it." I stared at her. "What?" "The scheme. The invoices, the shell company. That was me. Ryan knew I was skimming client accounts. He knew about maybe $40,000 that I told him was a split. He didn't know about the rest." She held my gaze steadily. "He thought we were running a small side arrangement. I was running something much larger and keeping the difference." The room rearranged itself around me. "You were defrauding him," I said slowly, "as well as his clients." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at her hands again. Then she spoke, and this is what she told me. The full version, in her own words, that I had asked for, and she finally gave. "I need to go back further than you probably expect. When I was 9, my father lost his job and didn't tell my mother for 3 months. He kept leaving the house at the same time every morning and coming back at the same time every evening, and the money just slowly stopped being there. The electricity, like I told you once. The food. I remember one specific Tuesday when my mother opened every cabinet in the kitchen looking for something to make for dinner, and there was nothing. Not low on things. Nothing. She sat down on the kitchen floor and she cried. And I stood in the doorway, and I was 9 years old, and I told myself, this will never happen to me. This specific feeling, this will never happen to me. When we got married, you were wonderful. You were kind and steady, and you loved me in a way I believed completely. But Stephen, you made $61,000 a year teaching school, and that was fine. It was enough, but it was never more than enough. And every month when I paid the bills, I would feel that old tightening. Not because we were struggling, because I could see how close the edge was if anything changed. If you got sick, if the roof needed replacing, if Owen needed something expensive, the edge was always visible from where I was standing, even when you couldn't see it at all. Ryan was. He was the affair first, and then he became something else. He started talking to me about the business accounts. He trusted me completely with the finances. And I saw, in those accounts, money moving in ways that were careless, invoices that were vague, subcontractors who were paid in cash. I understood immediately that there was room in that system. Not because Ryan put it there for me, because I recognized it, because I had spent my whole life looking for room. The first time I moved money, it was $11,000. I created a subcontractor invoice for a company that didn't exist, and the payment cleared, and I transferred it to the shell account I'd set up. I told myself it was a one-time thing, an emergency fund, something just for me, for the edge I could always see. I kept doing it because the feeling it gave me was not what I expected. I expected relief. What I felt instead was control. For the first time in my adult life, I had a number that was mine, that no one could touch, that existed outside of our budget and Ryan's business and every system that could fail. That feeling became, I can only describe it as a drug. Every transaction added to the number, and every time the number grew, the edge I'd been watching my whole life moved a little further away. Ryan found out about a small portion. I let him think he'd discovered something I was embarrassed about, a minor skim. He was angrier than I expected, and then he wasn't, because he understood that my silence about his other business practices was worth more to him than the $40,000 he thought he'd found. We became partners in his understanding. In mine, he became collateral. The affair had been real. I want you to know that it wasn't only transactional. I had real feelings for him in the beginning. But by the end, he was primarily useful. And I think I understood that about myself and kept going anyway. And that's the part one can't make clean no matter how I arrange the words. I'm sorry about the money from our account. The $18,000, that was panic after I realized the DCI investigation had started. I was trying to move things to a place they wouldn't find. It was stupid, and I knew it was stupid when I did it. I'm sorry about Ryan. I'm sorry about all of it. But I need you to understand that the thing driving all of it, the thing underneath everything, is the same thing that drove me when I was 9 years old standing in a kitchen doorway watching my mother cry on the floor. I never stopped being that child. I just got better at hiding it. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know you came here with a version of this story in your head, and what I'm telling you isn't it. I'm telling you anyway because you asked for the real version, and that's the only version I have left. She stopped. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed. I sat with everything she had said for a long time. The affair I had prepared for. The financial scheme I had partially mapped. What I had not prepared for was the specific loneliness of the picture she had drawn. A 9-year-old girl watching her mother cry on a kitchen floor, building an entire interior architecture around that single moment, carrying it for 30 years into a marriage and a job and a criminal investigation, and never once saying to me, "I am afraid." The edge is always there. I need you to see it. Why didn't you tell me? I said, about the fear. Not the money, the fear. She looked at me steadily. Because you would have said it was okay, she said. You always say it's okay. And I needed someone to take it seriously. That landed somewhere specific and stayed there. You're right, I said after a moment. I would have. She looked at her hands. Neither of us said anything for a while. I'm not going to be here for the trial, I said finally. The kids and I are going to stay with my mother through the school year. I'm going to file the divorce papers next week. Carol is handling it. She nodded. One small movement. I'll make sure the kids can reach you, I said. That's not going anywhere. Whatever happens legally, they're yours as much as mine. She looked up. Her eyes were bright. Thank you, she said. It came out very quietly. I stood up. I looked at her across the scratch divider. This woman I had married. This woman who had sat across from me at 1,000 dinners and lay beside me for 12 years and managed our money and read to our children and been afraid, quietly and constantly, in a way I had never thought to ask about. I'm sorry too, I said, for not asking. Then I walked out of the room and down the corridor and through the heavy door into the October air, and I did not look back, and the door closed behind me with a sound that was very final and also, somehow, very clean. We drove to Iris's house in Ames on a Friday evening, Owen and Chloe and me, with 3 weeks of clothes and the dog and Chloe's particular stuffed rabbit that she had named Gerald for reasons she had never explained. The drive took 40 minutes, and Owen sat in the front seat and asked questions I answered as honestly as his 11 years could hold, and Chloe sat in the back with Gerald and fell asleep before we reached the interstate. Iris had made the guest rooms ready without being asked. She was that kind of woman. She anticipated needs before they were expressed and met them without commentary. She had known Melissa for 12 years, and she said exactly one thing about the situation on the first evening after the kids were in bed. You did your best with what you knew. I didn't know enough, I said. No, she said, but you tried to. She paused. That's different from not trying. I wasn't sure she was right, but I let it sit. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The legal proceedings around Melissa's case took longer. A plea arrangement was reached in the spring, and she was sentenced to 31 months with eligibility for early release, plus restitution to Harlan Construction's defrauded clients. Ryan Harlan himself faced separate charges related to the practices Melissa had known about and remained silent on. That case was still moving through the courts when I stopped following it. Owen understood more than I told him and asked about it in the careful, precise way of a child who has decided to be older than he is. Chloe understood less, but felt more. She went through a phase of nightmares in November that required the light left on and Gerald positioned with particular exactness, and we managed it together, the three of us, in the small domestic democracy that forms when a household loses a member and the remaining ones figure out the new arrangement. Pete came to Ames in December to help me with some things at the house. We were going to sell it in the spring, and there was work to be done. We spent a Saturday on the roof and another in the basement, and at the end of the second day, sitting on the back porch with 2 beers and the particular exhaustion of physical work, he said, I should have said more at the cookout. I should have asked more, I said. He turned his beer. Yeah, but I still should have said more. We sat with that for a while. It was true on both sides, and there was nothing useful to add to it, so we didn't. I went back to teaching in January, at a school in Ames that had an opening in the history department. My new students were sophomores studying the Civil War, and I taught them about the things people tell themselves when they want to believe that what they're doing is something other than what it is. I taught it as history. I knew it as something else. Melissa called once, in February, from the facility. The call was brief and supervised, and she spent most of it talking to Owen and Chloe, which was right. At the end, she said to me, "Are you okay?" "Getting there," I said. "Good," she said. And she meant it. I could tell. I thought about her answer in the visitation room, because you would have said it was okay, for a long time after that call. She had not been wrong. I had spent 12 years being the person who smoothed things over, who kept the temperature comfortable, who absorbed friction without examining it. I had called this being supportive. What it had actually been was a kind of absence, a refusal to engage with the parts of our life that required more than comfort. That realization was not comfortable. I sat with it for months. I'm still sitting with it. What I understand now, on the other side of everything, is that conflict avoidance is not neutrality. It is a choice to prioritize the appearance of peace over the reality of it, to let things remain unexamined because examination costs something and you have decided, consciously or not, that you don't want to pay. I made that choice for 12 years, and I called it love, and it was partially love and also partially cowardice, and the two things were so tangled together that I couldn't separate them until they were already on the other side of a locked door. Chloe drew another picture in the spring. A house, again, but this one had all three of us inside it, and the house was smaller than the previous one, and she had put flowers along the bottom in the specific colors she liked. She gave it to me after school on a Thursday and said, "This is our new house." I made it look nice. "It does look nice," I said. She nodded with 7-year-old satisfaction. I made the door orange because that's a happy color. I put it on the refrigerator in Iris's kitchen, next to a permission slip for Owen's field trip and a grocery list, and I stood looking at it for a moment. A child's drawing of a house made to look nice, with a happy door for the 3 people living inside a new and smaller life. It was enough. It was more than enough. I did not look back at Cedar Falls. I did not look back at the marriage, at the house on Birchwood Lane, at the man I had been inside it. I had learned what there was to learn, and I had taken it with me, and I was going forward now, carrying the weight of it without being crushed by it, into whatever came next. That is where I leave this story, not at the arrest, not at the visitation room, not at the divorce filing, but at a refrigerator in Ames, Iowa, with an orange door and a child's drawing, and a man finally learning to stay in the room when things get difficult. The most disorienting moment in this story is not the arrest. It is the sentence Melissa delivers across the visitation room divider, "Because you would have said it was okay." That single line reframes 12 years of what Stephen understood as steadiness into something with a darker shape. A steadiness so consistent it had become a wall between them, preventing the kind of honest conversation that might have changed everything. Stephen's conflict avoidance was not the cause of Melissa's choices, but it created the specific conditions in which those choices could be made invisibly, without ever being challenged or even named. When a person learns that their fears are too much for their partner to take seriously, not because the partner is cruel, but because the partner reflexively soothes everything before examining it, they stop bringing those fears into the open. They find other containers for them. Melissa found the worst possible container: financial control exercised through fraud, justified to herself as the emergency fund her childhood had taught her she would always need. What makes her psychology particularly complex is that she was not simply deceiving Stephen. She was deceiving Ryan Harlan simultaneously, using the affair as cover for a scheme that eventually outgrew and eclipsed it. She had, in a sense, outmaneuvered everyone in her life, and that capacity for strategic concealment had been available to her precisely because the people around her, including her husband, had trained themselves not to look too closely. Ryan trusted her with the books. Stephen trusted her with the household finances. Both men had, in their different ways, outsourced their financial understanding to a woman whose deepest fear was financial precarity. The irony is almost structural. The 9-year-old girl on the kitchen floor, that image is where the story ultimately lives. Not in the fraud, not in the affair, not in the arrest. In a child watching her mother cry in front of empty cabinets and making a silent, absolute promise to herself that this would never happen again. That promise became the operating system beneath every decision Melissa made for 30 years, and no one in her adult life ever asked about it, because she presented a capable and composed surface that invited no deeper inquiry. Stephen's growth across the story is quiet but real. He moves from conflict avoidance as an unconscious default to conflict avoidance recognized and named, and there is a meaningful difference between those two states. The man who asked Pete to elaborate at the cookout and didn't, versus the man who stood up in the visitation room and said, "I'm sorry for not asking." Those are not the same person. The second one has paid a specific price for a specific lesson and carries it forward with clarity. The open question the story leaves is not whether Stephen will recover. He clearly will, in his careful, methodical way. The question it leaves is about the children. Owen and Chloe were inside this story too, absorbing its textures before they had vocabulary for it. Chloe drew the family with Melissa slightly apart, separated by a space she hadn't consciously placed. She drew the new house with an orange door because orange is a happy color. Children process what adults cannot say out loud, and they do it in the language available to them. Whether the lessons that shaped Melissa, the fear, the silence, the compulsive need for a private reserve against disaster, whether those lessons passed into her children is the question this story cannot answer and wisely doesn't try. What I keep coming back to is that 9-year-old girl on the kitchen floor. Not Melissa the bookkeeper, not Melissa the person who committed fraud. The child who made a promise to herself in a moment of genuine terror and then spent the next 30 years keeping it in the only way she knew how. Nobody asked her about that promise. Not Ryan, not Stephen. Maybe not even herself, not directly. And that silence, that specific, sustaining curiosity about what was driving her, is what allowed everything else to happen. We are all carrying promises we made to ourselves as children in moments of fear that we've never fully examined. Some of those promises protect us. Some of them quietly run our lives in ways we don't see until it's far too late. The question worth sitting with isn't what Melissa did. It's what promise you're still keeping, and whether anyone in your life has ever thought to ask,